Okay, you are listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5 in Philadelphia, on Comcast Channel 66, and streaming live at phillycam.org. You can find us on Twitter at Hall Monitor WPPM, on our website www.hallmonitor.org, or on Facebook at PHM WPPM. Tonight on the program, we'll be joined by Larry Eichel, Senior Advisor to Pew's Philadelphia Research and Policy Initiative. Vanessa Marie Graber will join us to discuss the latest mayoral forums, and Denise Clay Murray will give us a preview of her Friday column. Vanessa, how are you tonight?
Hey, I'm doing good. Thank you very much for having me on the show.
Oh, it's always good to see you. Always glad to be with you. I feel like there's about 70 days left or so before we get to the mayoral primary. But to me, that's an eternity. I think anything can happen between now and then,
Well, as you know, journalists are busy looking into the records of the candidates, and any new information can develop between now and then. And as you know, on Tuesday, which was yesterday, was a deadline to file petitions. So they'll be going through those in the next couple of weeks to determine who the real candidates are. So we might not even have all the same candidates by the end of it. Once that process is through, we'll know who actually has made it on the ballot and who maybe then has to resort to write-in campaign. But you're right, anything can happen. 70 days is not a long time, but also an eternity in the news cycle. And so we'll have to, wait and see.
All right. And Denise Clay Murray is here with us. Denise.
Hi.
How are you today?
I'm good. How are both of you? It's good to see you, Vanessa.
Yes, I'm doing well. Good to see you as well.
So it's oh, go ahead, Denise. I'm sorry.
Well, no, I overheard you all talking about how long we have left to put up with this. And trust me, you ever see those television shows where you have like the prisoners and they're like marking the days until they get out on a wall with like a little piece of chalk? That's kind of where I am in this process right now. And
I wake up every morning thinking, oh, we have more time in this thing. This is great. But so we're going to talk about that in the second half of the show. We're going to talk a little budget because last week we did a budget preview. Now we have some numbers. So I want to show you a little bit about that. But before we get to that, we have an interview with Larry Eichel from the Pew Charitable Trust and the research initiative over there, where he has a very good paper and article that people should take a look at that discusses Philadelphia's post-COVID recovery economically. This is really interesting work, and we were really lucky to be able to talk to Mr. Eichel about it. So here's our interview with Larry Eichel. Hey, Mr. Eichel, thank you so much for joining us.
Always good to be with you, Larry.
So the report that we're talking about today is a follow-up to a report Pew issued 2 years ago. Can you tell us a little bit about that report and then how this report builds on that work?
Yeah, I mean, actually, that report was out last year. And it was kind of a progress report on how the city was doing coming out of the pandemic. And we looked at that question in a number of ways, looking at the number of jobs in the city, the question of remote and hybrid work, the housing market, the types of jobs that were coming back and not coming back, all those sorts of things. And we just thought, almost a year later, that it was a good idea, especially given the timing that we're in. We're going to have a new mayor soon, that we take another look at it and see how things are updated, see how the city has been doing, whether it's getting closer to full recovery, whether that recovery is, and what we can say about that recovery and its nature.
One of the key points that you talked about in the report is employment. Has getting back to pre-pandemic levels of employment been a struggle here in Philadelphia, or are we on a track that gets us closer to that?
Well, we're certainly on a positive track. I mean, in 2022, the city gained a lot of jobs. I mean, depending on what kind of time period you look at it, 30,000 more or less. And obviously that was positive. Of course, that was happening all over the country as well. We looked at it sort of at the end of the third quarter, that is through end of September. And at that point, the city was still down about 4%, which is, 30,000 jobs more or less from where it had been before the pandemic. Now, by way of comparison, the rest of the country and the country as a whole and the rest of the region were almost back to where they'd been. They were, within a fraction of a percentage point of where they had been in 2019. So the city's coming back, but it's coming back much more slowly than the rest of the region and more slowly than the country as a whole. And interestingly, we're certainly not alone in that regard. If you compare us to some of the other big East Coast cities, particularly New York and Washington, we look pretty much the same. And we did anyway after the third quarter, down about 4% in terms of jobs in the city, down less than that in the surrounding suburbs. In fact, our suburbs seem to be doing better than the suburbs of some of those other regions. I can't tell you why that is. I've heard a lot of theories about it. The East Coast, major East Coast cities are quite dense. They're denser than cities in some of the other parts of the country. So that in the early stages of the pandemic, that might have been a factor in people wanting to leave or businesses wanting to close. The East Coast cities tended to take the pandemic more seriously in terms of restrictions. That may be a factor. I mean, I don't think anyone knows for sure. There is some more recent data that is not final data, but through the end of the year, and the city, like the rest of the country, had a pretty good fourth quarter. So if you look at the fourth quarter, we're only down, say, 2.5% from where we were 4 years ago, rather than 4%. And but the nation now is now over the number where it was in 2029, fully recovered and then some. But we still see that gap of 3 or 4 percentage points between how we're doing, how the rest of the region is doing, and how the country is doing. That has been a relatively permanent fixture throughout the last 2.5 years.
So pre-pandemic to now, it doesn't seem like the industries that make up Philadelphia's economy have changed as much in terms of the overall number in the workforce and what percentage they make into our economy. Did that surprise you at all?
Well, I don't know whether it surprises me. In the Great Recession of 2007, 8 into 9, we actually did, initially we did less poorly than the rest of the country, and then had a relatively slow recovery, and had been doing better than the rest of the country in terms of jobs. And not a lot better, but a little better than the rest of the country in the immediate pre-pandemic period. So this pattern is a little different.
One of the other things that the report touches on is office space usage and commuting and whether or not people are going back to work in person. Now, I think office space usage in center city is about 50% of what it was prior to the pandemic for commercial office spaces. The industries that rely on people working in the city and things like SEPTA and all this, how are they adjusting to this trend, and can they adjust?
I think it's a real challenge. As we note in the report, SEPTA is in their December traffic report said that the system ridership was at 52% of pre-pandemic levels and regional rail was at 46%. And their office occupancy is a tough thing to measure. The Center City District had a report that came out in late in the fall that said about 50% it was about 50% occupancy. Then they came out with some other numbers more recently that are a little different from that. We have numbers for the region that put it at 42%. We don't, like I say, it's something that no one ever thought of measuring before. So the measurements now are sort of a work in progress, but it does have big implications for the city. It has implications in terms of wage taxes, although that's a very complicated topic. And there are other tax revenues that workers generate through their purchases when they're in the city, particularly when these are suburbanites, who, if they stay home, aren't making purchases in the city. And this affects the survival of the service businesses that depend on the presence of those workers and the people who rely on the jobs in those businesses to support their own families. Long term, it's a really interesting question. If hybrid work is going to be the model long term for office workers, obviously this is not for everybody. There's still a lot of jobs that require people to be there. But for office workers who can do their jobs from home, if sort of a hybrid model kicks in and the expectation is you're going to be in your office 2 or 3 days a week and not on Monday and Friday or whatever, businesses are going to look at all the office space they have and think, we don't need all the space we have now. And they're going to want to take less space. This is going to develop slowly over time because office leases tend to be quite long. And the vast majority of them have not come up since the pandemic, but obviously they will. And if there is a lessened demand for office space, that is going to have a number of implications, including for city property taxes in a roundabout way. That is, the property tax the city collects from an office building, it is based on the income the office building generates through the rents it charges its tenants. And if those rents decline, or even if they simply don't rise over time, if there's less in demand for that office space, the value of the buildings from a tax standpoint is going to go down, and the tax collections from the buildings are going to go down. Now, I mean, there's no way of knowing how big an issue that's going to be over time, but it's something that city officials are certainly aware of and are watching, and is a concern.
And in that vein, another area that the report touches on is housing prices. And this has been a huge issue in the city because we've seen these reassessments go very high. What are we seeing right now?
Yeah, I mean, there was, in the first year or two after the pandemic, prices went way up. Partially because interest rates were still very low, and also because there just wasn't that much on the market. People were staying put. Now, in the last 6 months and more, things have really cooled off, and that probably has a lot to do with mortgage rates, but housing prices actually declined in the second half of 2022, and rents have at least stabilized as well. They were going up pretty substantially as well. So, we'll see how long this lasts. I know the trends in the housing market during the pandemic have elevated a lot of concerns that some people have about the city becoming unaffordable for some residents. As I say, things are moderating, and we'll see how long that lasts.
And how do all these things put together affect city revenues?
Well, the interesting thing is that city revenues through the past fiscal year, which ended June the 30th of 2022, have been really strong. I think surprisingly strong. There was a huge increase. The city ended the year with a fund balance of $775 million, which is a very large figure, even in a budget that is in excess of $5 billion. It's a big number. The business and income and receipts tax, which is the main tax on businesses in the city, that was up quite a bit, and the wage tax was up by a large amount too. Although when you compare it to the sort of pre-pandemic number, it's up less than sort of inflation over that period, but it rebounded quite substantially in the past year. The city also, as you know, has benefited from an influx of the federal funds through the American Recovery Program, $1.4 billion they got in 2021 and 22, which has to be committed by the end of next year for use, and that certainly helped. But for now, the city budget is in pretty good shape.
All right, I'd like to bring Denise Clay Murray here on For the Left of My Mind.
Thank you, Larry, and thank you for spending some time with us today, Mr. Eichel. I really appreciate it. You mentioned office space and the fact that because people aren't going into the office, you have all of this unused space. What do you think ultimately happens with that? I mean, I know that the leases haven't expired for a lot of these places, but I myself am recovering from my second bout of COVID. So we're going through a second round with this disease. How will that impact things?
Yeah, I mean, let me talk about the office space anyway. The question with the office space is whether it can be used for other. I mean, there's some question about how quickly any changes should be made, because some people are still expecting that we'll see more and more people coming back to work over time, and maybe the lessened demand for office space will not be too big. We'll see. But assuming that it's substantial, then the question is, what else can you do with the space? And some of the older buildings in particular may lend themselves to conversion to residential use. There are issues with that in terms of cost, in terms of zoning rules, and obviously there's the question of whether there is demand for it, but that's certainly a possibility. Some of the newer office buildings, which presumably would be the last ones that anyone would think about converting, are harder to convert because a lot of them tend to be bigger and have a sort of central core of elevators and other functions in the middle that just make it sort of hard to figure out how you would create apartments out of all those spaces. But certainly conversion to residential is something we'll see. I think we'll see if it plays out this way. But it's going to take time, and there will be obstacles to it, and there'll have to be a lot of city will have to be flexible about what do you do with this space if you don't need it anymore. And as I say, there are some people who would argue you ought to kind of go very cautiously here because if things change and the city grows and so on, you may want that office space again.
Okay. Now, you also mentioned that there was more, well, what I'm seeing is there's more housing construction going on. Apartment buildings are going up and different things. Do you think that this will have any kind of impact on the affordability issues? Because a lot of these apartment buildings are high end.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. A lot of them are high end. There are some economists who would argue that just building any amount of housing, regardless of the price point, it is good for the market for everybody. On the theory that even if there's new high-end housing that comes along, that will push the prices down of the housing that's not new and not so fancy, and will benefit everyone. I'm not sure that's true. I've heard that argument made. We'll see. But the city obviously has a lot of people who are spending a large amount of their income on housing, a larger amount than the experts say is healthy. We at Pew have done some analysis of this, and it's really more an income problem than a housing cost problem. It's not that housing here is more expensive than in a lot of other places. In fact, it's not compared to the other big cities on the East Coast. It's just that we have a lot of people with low incomes, and they cannot afford what's out there, and that is a huge structural problem for the city that kind of goes beyond what's being built now. Another thing about all the housing that's being built now, as I'm sure your viewers know, that the city for many years had a 10-year abatement on new residential construction that was modified recently, and it phased out at the end of 2021 and was replaced by a new abatement that was basically half as generous as the first one was. And as a result of that, a lot of developers got their projects on the books before the end of 2021, and many of them started building last year. So there's a lot of housing coming into the market or in construction now. For that reason, the number of permits that were issued last year was quite a bit lower than the year before, reflecting that change in the law. Obviously there's a question too of whether there's going to be demand, whether there's going to be people to fill all these units. Philadelphia, before the pandemic, had been gaining population fairly steadily for nearly 15 years after decades of population decline. The first post-pandemic population numbers from the census, which took us through the middle of 2021, showed that we lost about 25,000 people in the first year of the pandemic, which is a fairly substantial number. We're going to, next month, we're going to get the numbers for the second year of the pandemic from July 1st, 2021 to June 30th, 2022. And that will really tell us something of whether that initial sort of loss of population was just sort of immediate reaction to the pandemic, whether people came back, whether new people have come in, whether things have stabilized, whether the city maybe is growing again, or whether it's continuing to contract. And I think that will tell us a lot about whether there are going to be people to fill that new housing construction, and whether they're going to be people to fill jobs, and by their presence to generate jobs, to expand the economy. That's an important number, and I say it'll be out in a few weeks.
Okay. Well, thank you. And I'm going to give you back to my co-host, Lawrence McGlynn, and you're listening to Hall Monitor on WPPM 106.5.
Thank you, Denise. And Ms. Reichel, thank you so much, as always, for coming on and joining us.
Anytime. Obviously, we enjoy talking about our work. We think it's stuff that people ought to know about.
All right. We'd like to thank Mr. Reichel for joining us here on WPPM 106.5. You can find all the Pew reports, and they do great work. There's a lot of stuff there at pew.org, and there's a tremendous amount of information about Philadelphia there specifically. So we'd like to thank you again. So Denise, we know what happened last week. The budget was released by the mayor's office before at City Council. And there were, in my opinion, a couple of good surprises. So I want to run through a couple of things really quick. Now, last week, we did a little primer on what the budget is. We used the 2023 budget just as an example. So this year, tonight, we have this year's budget, upcoming budget, sort of filling in what we showed you last week. So I'll run through this and show people what we're talking about. There we go. So we're talking about the fiscal year 2024 operating budget. Now, there's the operating budget, the capital budget, school budget. There's all kinds of things. Tonight, we're going to focus on the operating budget because that is the day-to-day budget. And I think that's probably where we should start. And we're going to talk capital budget and all the other budgets as we go forward. But we'll start with operating budget tonight. So one of the key things about the operating budget, first of all, this is the first time we have gone over $6 billion for an operating budget. And some people might recoil in horror at that. I actually think it's a good thing. And we'll talk a little more about that. So the expenditures will be $6.1 billion. The revenue is $5.9 billion. Now you might be saying, well, how do we have more expenditures than revenue? And the answer is the city is going to be using some of its American Recovery Plan funds, the COVID money that came from the federal government. And there's going to be a $525 million fund balance, which is the highest fund balance I can remember. So when you look at the economic picture of the city right now, just in terms of revenue, it's the best position we've seen in a very long time. So what are the highlights in this year's budget? So there are a couple of things that I think really stand out. So this year's budget is going to make a $282 million contribution to the school district. What does that mean? Basically, the school district gets some of its money, the majority of its money, from property taxes here in the city. They get some from the state and some from the federal government, not as much as you would think. So the city is going to give the school district $282 million. And when they do that, it's basically just saying, here's the money. There are no stipulations attached to that. It's, use it for what you think you need it for. The city is also going to have $233 million for gun violence prevention programs. We're going to talk more about that maybe in a couple of weeks about what happened last time the city invested in some of these programs, and hopefully that there will be some changes the way they do it this time. There's going to be $11.5 million for Mercado scholarships, $47.5 million for rebuild, which is rebuilding public parks and city infrastructure. $37 million to expand library services 6 days per week. It's something we've been talking about for a long time. Libraries aren't usually open on weekends, and Saturdays would be a great day to have libraries open. It looks like that's what they're going to be doing here. 2.5 million for expanded street sweeping and 4 million to combat illegal dumping, something that I feel like is just getting worse and worse as we go. 5 million for criminal justice related debts. And this is really interesting. One of the things they're going to do here is, if you were convicted of a lower level crime or something like that, and you're trying to get your record expunged, it can really hold you back if you don't have the money to do this, because some of these things are expensive. Anything in the legal system can be expensive. So the city's going to help people, get some of these things taken care of. So, when they go for job interviews and things like that, it doesn't show up. $29 million over 5 years for eviction prevention, another program we saw that was very, very successful. 6.7 million over 5 years for 100 housing units for homeless people, and 3.2 million for tiny homes. And this is something I've been talking about for a while. I think this is a really interesting idea, the tiny homes and the housing for homeless people. It's been done in other areas with some success, and I think trying it here is really worthwhile. So in this budget, you get the program rolling. If we think it's good, if it's doing what it should be doing next year, maybe expand it. So that's a good thing to see. And $20 million for the FDR park improvements. That's a little bit of a hot button right now, but it's something that we're going to be talking about. We know Councilmember Kenyatta Johnson, it's in his district, and he's keeping a very close eye on that, and maybe we'll be able to have him on soon to tell us more about that. One thing that I think is really interesting about this, and I think it's wonderful, and I'm glad they're trying this, the Kenney administration is going to commit $62 million for fare-free transit for 25,000 Philadelphians who are below the poverty level. This is a really great idea, because one of the issues with transit is, it's $2.50 to get a bus ride, another $2.50 to come the other way if you have to do a transfer, But one of the things that people may not realize, if you have the SEPTA card, it's a $2 ride, but you have to have a bank account for that. So if you don't have a bank account, which more people than you might realize don't have bank accounts, it's more expensive to ride SEPTA. So I think this is a really nice idea and something we should be trying. And the city is also going to spend $9 million as a perk for current employees and employees are trying to attract to ride SEPTA for free. So these are good ideas. These are some good things. So where does the money come from? Where does our revenue come from? So wage tax is the biggest source of revenue for the city. It's $1.7 billion. 30% of our budget comes from the wage tax. The real estate tax is $836 million. It's about 14%. The BERT tax, which is the business and receipt tax, is about $709 million, so almost 12% of our budget. The real estate transfer tax, $432 million, about 7.2%. Sales tax, $294 million, about 5% of our budget. Beverage tax is close to $70 million, about 1.2%. And all the other taxes in the city come to about $47 million, so not quite 1%, which is really interesting. We'll have to talk about that another time, because there are multiple other taxes in the city, but they're probably less than 1% of the overall budget, which is really interesting. So if you're looking at that, you're thinking, okay, 70% of our revenue comes from taxes. Where's the other 30% come from? Well, it comes from a lot of different places. So we get non-tax revenue. That's about 6% of the budget, about $353 million. And when we talk about non-tax revenue, that's things like permits for building, tickets, those kinds of things. Okay. We get state funds, which is actually not a lot, about $252 million. So about 4.2% of our budget. We get federal funds, but not a lot. And this is not counting the American Recovery Plan funds. Probably about less than $30 million. In that, we get money from the gas company. Gas Works about $18 million. From other government agencies, it's about $48 million, so less than 1%. Water fund, aviation fund, they're all much less than 1%. And then when we get to other city funds, that's where the ARP money was kind of put in. So we've had that money, so it's not directly from the government, now it's from us. So that's about almost 500 million, about 450 million. So that's 7.5% of our budget. And then the portion of the wage tax, that's the PICA tax, is about 6 million, 500 and some million. So it's about 7.5% of the budget. And just for a refresher, the PICA tax is 1.5% of the wage tax. That goes to the state to pay off bond debt from 30 years ago, which is almost up now. I think it's up this year. And so now we'll keep all that money. So that's where all our money comes from. So, and this is a chart. It's not exactly the easiest thing to see. We can put this in the newsletter this weekend or this Friday so people can see it if they want to look at it this way. But it just sort of breaks down the revenue and the expenditures. Okay. So where does the money go? What do we spend it on? Well, $2.1 billion in this budget is going to be payroll. 1.3 billion are contractual services, and pensions 863 million, and other employee benefits 796 million. So those are your four biggest categories of expenditures in the city budget. And there are other expenditures as well, but those are the big four. And it's really all for services: hiring people, paying people, contracting other people to do things that the city doesn't necessarily do. So that's where your money goes. And just to give you, here are the biggest ticket items by department. Police department, 855 million. Fire department, just over 400 million. The sinking fund is 324 million. And sinking fund is debt service. So like bonds and things that the city is taking out that we have to pay back. That's the amount right there. Prisons, 288 million. The contribution that we are giving to the city is giving to the school district, 282 million. Human services budget, 213, about 214 million. Not their entire budget though, because they get federal and state money. That's just the city portion. And the managing director's office, 165, almost 166 million. And the managing director is the person in charge of like police, streets, all the day-to-day stuff in the city. That person kind of runs, and that's Tumar Alexander. So that's where the money's going. And here's again, not exactly the easiest thing to see. We'll put this in the newsletter as well, but it's a nice pie chart that shows you the breakdown of where all the money goes. The other thing I want to talk about, and we've discussed taxes on the show before. And I have a typo in there, I just noticed. The wage tax is going to drop from 3.9% to 3.765%, not 5.83. I don't know how that got there. But
I was going to say that's not a drop.
No, it wouldn't be. But it is coming down a little bit. Believe it or not, though, with that reduction in the tax, the 2024 projections show the wage tax will increase a little bit. So we're actually going to bring in a little bit more in wage taxes, even with the reduction. The BERT tax, which is the business tax, is going to be reduced from 5.9% to 5.83%. And I remember last year when that BERT tax came down to 5.9, everyone kind of made that a big deal. It's coming down even more now. We're going to lose money on that one. So about $20 million decrease because of the BERT. And taxes are something we can talk about, maybe in another show, because it's really important how we look at that. And I think that's everything. So that's your budget in a nutshell. In the coming weeks, we're going to be talking about different parts of the budget with members of the administration. We're going to be reviewing the budget hearings when they begin at the end of March. So we'll be talking a lot about that. And, so we're going to have a lot on the budget. And what I think that sort of where we start now is not usually where we end with the budget. There are usually changes. And this is probably going to go through June. Usually the budget's passed at the last council meeting before the end of the spring session, before the summer recess. So I do think that there are going to be changes, and there's going to be a lot to talk about with budget as we move forward. So that's where we are right now, and a lot more to come.
I just want to know what an anti-violence investment is. That there's $233 million set aside for anti-violence investments, but it doesn't tell you what these investments are. And and from my experience covering the HIV/AIDS crisis, I've seen the federal government say that they were putting money into AIDS research, or that was actually not going specifically to AIDS research. It was going to things like researching the common cold and different things like that. And my fear here is that these anti-violence investments might include things that have nothing to do with dealing with the trauma that is a part of what people who are experiencing gun violence or who are in neighborhoods that are experiencing gun violence are actually dealing with. So I'm especially interested in seeing what the administration means when it says anti-violence investments.
Well, and speaking of anti-violence, Vanessa Maria Graber is here, and she attended a mayoral forum that dealt with anti-violence policies. So, Vanessa, what happened there?
Well, a lot happened. There was a lot of ideas, but I'm with Denise. I also have a lot of questions about what the city plans to do this year, especially in light that we have seen through investigative journalism that a lot of the monies were not well spent. Some of the organizations that received money and the police, misappropriated that money. So certainly a lot of questions there about what that amount of money is actually funding. So in case you missed it, last week, WHYY and Ceasefire PA hosted a mayoral forum on gun violence. 8 out of the 10 candidates attended. So missing from the group was Jeff Brown and Amin Brown. It was a short answer format, so they had about 2 minutes to answer questions. They couldn't really debate each other because the questions were targeted. And the moderators were not journalists. They were people from the community, from different grassroots organizations. So definitely really refreshing to see people from the community holding these candidates accountable for some of their plans. There wasn't anything too shocking or revealing in that forum. Of course, I've attended several other mayoral forums where a lot of the same answers were given. So there was quite a bit of repetition there. Although there were a couple questions that led to some surprising answers. One of the questions from the moderators is yes or no format, right? So they had to hold up a panel, and that was whether or not they would replace the current police leadership. Now, they didn't mention Commissioner Outlaw by name, but I guess that was implied. And most of the candidates said that they would. They held up the yes sign. Alan Dom held up a no sign. Cheryl Parker really struggled. She kept putting up yes, no, finally landed on yes. And Rebecca Reinhardt, who's the former city controller, said yes, but couch that and, we would want to acknowledge that it's been really difficult for the current commissioner to be able to implement her plans under the current administration. So that was the one that was really interesting to me. At the beginning of the forum, they were asked how they would tackle gun violence. And so one by one, at least the former city council members said that what they would be able to do as mayor that they weren't able to do as city council. They were also asked questions about how to prioritize, the crisis that we have right now with the high homicide rate and wanting to stop shootings with, a long-term community intervention approach. They were also asked about community policing. Now, that was also something that was a little surprising to me because it seems like everybody has different definitions of what community policing is. And so when the candidates answered, some of them mentioned wanting more police walking the beats, connecting with community members, while others talked about having listening sessions, engaging with the community, and finding out how they actually wanted to work with police, if at all. And so those are two different approaches to community policing. But one thing is pretty universal is that, there was quite a bit of mention on investing in more money from the budget in communities most affected by gun violence, wanting to focus on youth, right? Since a lot of the crime related to gun violence is people under the age of 25 years old, wanting to create economic opportunities, improve education, and use evidence-based approaches. I think because it's a Democratic primary, they're all from the same party. We didn't see a whole lot of divergence, right? They're more or less within the same camp around, wanting to invest more, wanting to work with community. The only part that's a little wavering is how much they want to add more police, work with police, and impose police on neighborhoods. So super interesting. I could go through what each of the candidates talked about, but I think it's best for the listeners to go to their pages and read some of their plans. Some of the plans don't have a lot of information there, to be honest. When I went to look at the plans that they had mentioned in these forums, some of them were quite detailed. So, for example, Derek Green really struggled to answer the questions and didn't give a lot of detail. But then surprisingly, when I went on his page, he has a super detailed plan called Getting Guns Off the Streets. And there's just a lot of information in there. Similarly, James DeLeon also mentioned his local incident management system, which we've heard about before. He's really touting this as the thing. And then when I went to his website, there's just a couple bullet points. There's really not a lot of information there. Sherelle Parker similarly mentioned her comprehensive plan. It's called the Neighborhood Safety and Community Policing Plan. Now, this plan was authored while she was on city council. It is very comprehensive, and it focuses on prevention, interventions, and enforcement. It also talks about community policing, although, again, that definition, not sure where they got that from. There's no footnotes there. And I think in general, Parker and Gim, made some, let's say, I don't want to say digs, but, some remarks where clearly they were talking about one another without mentioning each other's names. They're probably each other's biggest competition. But Parker mentioning things like, some people think that we can achieve change through the bullhorn, and I know that that's not how that happens, and also questioning people's actual experience with community organizing and community-based programming. And I think Gim, talked up all of her experience organizing in the community and as being one of the only candidates that had actually organized parents and families. And I think Maria Quinones Sanchez drew her line in the sand saying police is not the solution, that we need a more comprehensive approach. And she talked about things like reducing blight, improving sanitation, fixing crumbling infrastructure. She was the only one that didn't have a really pro-police stance on policing and gun violence. She talked more about investing in community organizations. So again, I think most of these plans are more or less within the same framework. And I think that there wasn't a whole lot of disagreement on these strategies, aside from the things that I mentioned. Curious to see what candidate David O would say, a Republican or somebody from Working Families Party or another third party. That's where I think you would see a lot more variety on how to tackle gun violence in Philadelphia.
Now, Vanessa, when we hear the candidates who are running for mayor who used to be on city council, when they start talking about, well, I can do more as a mayor than I could on city council, how do you buy that? And do you see issues there with maybe inaction on council versus what they are claiming they would do as mayor?
So there are things that they could not do as city council members. And so a few of them mention the mayor's power to convene all of the city agencies. And so Helen Gim talked about this. I would convene all of the city agencies. I would use the convening power of the mayor, she said. She also said that she would declare a state of emergency on day one. That's not something you can do while you're on city council. Now, this Rebecca Reinhardt wasn't on city council, but she also mentioned all these policy proposals that she presented, reports that she had authored, and audits that she had done that had very clear recommendations for a path forward that were not adopted by Mayor Kenney. And she felt really frustrated as city controller that she did not have the power to act on some of those things. The mayor also guides the budget, right? So you just talked about the budget for the next fiscal year. Obviously, the mayor has to sign off for that. Quite a few of them mentioned how they would prioritize different needs of the budget while they were mayor. And so, I say, there are some things that you cannot do as a city council person. But, when Alan Dunn talks about a crisis of leadership and passes the buck to the Kenney administration and says it's, there's no leadership and that's why we don't have what we need. That's one of the areas where I would question, well, you are all leaders too as city council members. We have state representatives. We have federal representatives, right? There's all kinds of leaders that can take action. I don't think the blame falls squarely with the mayor in that regard. And even if Alan Dunn were to become mayor and become a leader, if you will, he would have to work with the city council on that, right? So there's shared responsibility and shared leadership. So in general, there are some things that they couldn't do while on city council. But at the end of the day, whether they are on city council or elected mayor, they're going to have to work together as a party in order to get these things done.
And you make a good point about that, because in the end, one of these people is going to be the Democratic nominee. And unless folks decide they're going to go completely off the reservation, which is totally possible, because you're dealing with some pretty major league egos here, they're going to have to work together to get whoever becomes the ultimate nominee elected. And, which is why some of the hits that they're leveling at each other are kind of interesting, because basically you're giving your opponent opposition research, but that's kind of the point here when you're trying to become the ultimate nominee. Now, I guess the question I have is, earlier in this process, the whole subject of Danielle Outlaw and whether or not she stays or goes, most people stayed away from because they saw it as a personnel issue. I wonder what changed here.
Yeah, Sherelle Parker and her team has gone on record saying we don't comment about personnel issues while on the campaign. And so I think that's why she struggled to answer that question. But I actually think it was the format of the debate where they actually had to hold up there wasn't a I don't know or maybe or no comment paddle. It was yes or no. And some people very quickly raised the yes paddle. And you know what it's like when you're in a group of people and decision needs to be made. There's quite a bit of pressure. It was being live streamed and broadcast. And so I do think that there was a lot of pressure due to the nature of the question format and the others quickly raising their hands to make a decision. Obviously they could have abstained, but there probably would have been reported on as, why did they abstain when everybody else said yes or no? And I'm sure that it's not just a clear yes or no, as Rebecca Reinhardt and Alan Dunn were able to comment. They had this ability to do what's called an opt-in. And so they could chime in on a question maybe that wasn't directed to them or offer an additional response. And they had like a few of those. And so they used their opt-in opportunities to couch, the answer to that question, to give further context. But I think, the question just keeps getting asked and people want to know. And I think that, leadership is also questionable, right? Like, is it the police commissioner? Is it the leadership of the FOP, which has an enormous amount of power and influence over police and personnel decisions? Is it some of the other higher ranking police officers or police administrators that are problematic? Not super clear when you only can give a yes or no answer. But you're right. They had been hesitant to call her out before. But I think as the number of homicides continues to rise, we're seeing, the especially horrific death of the police officer from Temple unfold in the media, where there's a lot of accountability right now, even though it was a Temple police officer, and even Temple University is looking to hold their leadership accountable for public safety. There are a lot of questions right now about how the current police administration is working to keep people safe.
Okay.
And, we're going to be, Vanessa, you're going to be with us throughout the rest of this, at least through May, working on this. And you'll be with us on other things as well, but definitely on the forums.
Yeah,
So
there's a
thank
few
you.
more forums to come. I do want to highlight one happening at Taller Puerto Riqueño, which is all about the arts. And so at a
Oh.
place like Philly Cam and many other arts organizations that receives funding, it's often first on the chopping block. It will be really refreshing, I think, to move away from public safety onto some other issues like the arts. And so we'll definitely be at that one. I'm sure there'll be a Philly Camp presence there. And just one more note before we leave, over 90 candidates filed paperwork yesterday in order to run for city offices. That includes 12 mayoral candidates, over 60 people for city council, and many others for sheriff, controller, and register of wills. So in the next 2 weeks, we'll be keeping an eye on who actually makes the ballot and becomes official. And I'll keep you up to date on all of that.
And actually, I'm going to be at a candidates forum tomorrow. I'm going to be participating in the NAACP's candidates forum at the String Theory Charter School. And this one focuses on education and technology. Why you would put those two together, I don't know, because education should probably be its own forum. But hey, I'm just a panelist. I don't get to make it up. So if you're near String Theory Charter School at 16th and Vine, between 5:30 and 8:30 tomorrow night, come check us out.
All right. Well, Vanessa, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Always a pleasure to join the Hall Matter team and do this coverage of what's happening at City Hall and with the elections. And as you mentioned, we now have 69 days until Election Day. And so we'll be here to answer all your questions and keep you informed. If you're listening and you have questions about voter registration, mail-in ballots, or these races, hit us up on Hall Monitor and let us know. And we'll try to give you the information you need.
Absolutely. All right. Thank you, Vanessa. Now, Denise, we only have a couple minutes left here. What are you going to be focusing on Friday in our newsletter?
Well, I think I'm going to be focused a little bit on this forum that I'm going to be participating in tomorrow night, because education is one of the things that we really need to talk about the most. And we don't talk about it enough or we haven't talked about it enough in this election cycle. But the main thing I want to talk about is the fact that we need people in government that understand that the school district and the city government are two different independent entities. Right. Because when you sit down and talk to a lot of these candidates, even those that have actually been in city government, you find out that they may not understand that. And that's important.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. There's a belief, and also amongst the electorate, that city government and the school district are like the same thing. And while there are some connections, not really. So we do have to go. We're out of time. We want to thank Larry Eichel for being with us, Vanessa Maria Graber, Clay Murray, as always. Next week, we'll be back with Lance Haver, and we'll be talking more budget with members of the administration. So thank you all for being here, and we'll see you next week.